Hello, everyone, and welcome to the American Civil War and UK History channel on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And remember, if you go onto YouTube to sign in and subscribe, there is now a little watermark down in the corner to subscribe from. Also, most of my videos will be available as podcasts at some point in the future. So, joining me today is John Messner, and me and him will be discussing the blockade running and shipbuilding in Britain and Britain's involvement in the American Civil War. John is curator of the Transport and Technology Riverside Museum in Glasgow. So firstly, tell us a little bit about yourself and obviously your role at the museum, John.
Well, hi, Darren. Thank you very much for having me on. I'm one of the transport and technology curators at Glasgow Museums. I look after part of the transport and technology collection, primarily at the Riverside Museum, which was the museum it opened 10 years ago now, but it's at the banks of the Kelvin and Clyde, where the two rivers come together. My day job is usually looking after the railways, trams, buses, and subways that we have at the museum. But I also worked on a display all the way back in 2015 about Glasgow's role in the American Civil War.
Okay, and as you see here, we've got a picture of the museum. It's quite fancy. So when was this new? Is this a new building?
It was. It opened in June of 2011, so we're fastly approaching our 10-year anniversary. It replaced a very much loved former transport museum, the Kelvin Hall in Glasgow. And that replaced a previous transport museum that was operated in one of the old tram works. The Transport Museum, as the locals in Glasgow call it, is one of the best loved museums in the city. You always go there for school visits. You get taken there by your parents or your granny and your granddad. They'll tell you about the old trams in the city or the steam trains. So in 2011, this new building was opened, and it's the first ever dedicated building for the transport and technology collection. It allowed us to very much focus the building and the displays on the objects that we have, and to tell as much of what our visitors were asking for, which was about kind of the human personal stories behind our objects. So we're not a museum of technology. It doesn't look at the start of shipbuilding all the way to well, it's still going now, but it doesn't look all the way through. We're telling stories about our collection, stories about our objects. And we were very lucky to be awarded the European Museum of the Year Award in 2013.
Cool. I'm going to come and visit, I think. It looks nice.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah. So again, like you mentioned just a minute ago, in 2015, you co-curated a display about Glasgow and its role in the American Civil War. So just tell us a little bit more detail about that, please.
I worked with our maritime curator to create this display, which looks at what Glasgow had to do with the American Civil War. Primarily, one of the things that was happening in the city was the building or the retrofitting of steamers to run the blockade, which we'll be talking about in just a little bit. The display mainly looks at that, and it looks at what these steamers were carrying into the Confederacy, what they were taking out of the Confederacy. But we also have a section looking at what was going on in the city in the 1860s. Yes, the shipyards were benefiting from this, and their workforce was benefiting from this. But there was also a very large anti-slavery movement. There was lots of debates being had throughout the city on should we support the Confederacy, because a lot of most of the cotton that was used in mills across Britain was coming from there, and it was being starved because of the blockade. Or should the city and its people and its industries, shun the Confederacy because of its obviously links with enslavement of people? So this display very much tries to kind of look at those kind of aspects through some absolutely fantastic ship models, a beautiful oil painting, which is primarily the reason I'm here today, along with a cotton dress made from cotton more than likely brought through or grown in the southern states, an infield rifle to represent the weapons being sent back and forth. Also some banknotes from the Confederacy, which represents kind of the human aspect, because quite a few Scottish printers and engravers went through the blockade to help set up kind of initial trappings of a new state, making your own banknotes, making your own treasury notes, and so on.
Cool, that's really cool. Anyway, I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. So you're the author of a book about a Scottish blockade runner in the American Civil War, and by the name of Jonas
Wiley,
of the steamer Advance, and we'll get onto that again later. I just wanted to bring that up quickly. So let's move on. There were two British shipyards heavily involved in building and all of this, and one was the Mersey in Liverpool, and the other one was, of course, the Clyde in Glasgow. Tell us a little bit about the two ports that were heavily involved in the shipbuilding.
Yeah, in the early 1860s, both the River Clyde and River Mersey were home to numerous shipyards on both banks of both rivers. The British Empire was starting to move to its height. So merchantmen, warships, and all different types of vessels were needed to supply not only the domestic trades and trades going to Europe, but also, all points across the globe. So these included sailing ships, clipper ships, steamers, liners, paddle steamers like you see here. These were the two main shipbuilding areas in Britain. Bristol, London, the Northeast, Sunderland, and so on. They also had quite large shipbuilding industries. But for the purposes of talking about the Civil War, it really is the Mersey and the Clyde, where the ships that were built for the blockade, as well as the more famous armed vessels that the Confederacy bought, were built. So what this meant was, when the war started, 1861, the Confederacy, or the states that made it up, didn't really have much of anything, really, when it came to a navy, when it came to a merchant marine. Most of the industrial strength of the United States was in the north. So the Confederacy was looking for these types of things, things that could supply their needs. They're looking for armed vessels that could defend those kind of supply lines, but also take the war to the Union Navy at home and abroad. And two of the best places to find these vessels, to either retrofit or commission these vessels, was Liverpool and Glasgow. And what that meant over the next 5 years was a huge increase or influx of capital, of orders, of sales of vessels that benefited the ship owners, the shipbuilders, obviously the people that were building these vessels, all the ancillary kind of trades, rope making, ironmongering, anchor making, all those kind of things. And it was these two ports, as I said, that were the main focus, or the main area where these ships were coming from.
Yeah, and again, I mean, as far as I'm aware, the Confederates and the Union both sent representatives to Europe at the beginning of the war, didn't they, to try and acquisition weapons and ships and everything. So Britain was heavily, obviously, involved in the cotton trade. Do you think the Confederacy used this as a bartering point with the British?
Well, it was one of the things that they had hoped would bring Britain and France as well, either into the conflict on their side, or at least almost be not quite neutral when it came to supporting them. Britain at the time, 1860s, the biggest export was finished cotton goods. Cotton doesn't like to grow in our quite damp, cold environment here, and over 70% of the raw cotton that was used in British mills was coming from the southern states of the US. So when the war started, one of the key bargaining chips that the Confederacy thought they would have would be to force these European powers, through economic pressure, through denying them of cotton. So one of the first things they tried to do, which became known as the King Cotton diplomacy, or King Cotton strategy, was to withhold cotton from being shipped to Europe. So over millions of pounds of cotton was just left on the dockyards or on the farms in the South, and much of it was even burned. Unfortunately, for the South. There had been some good crops the previous years, and at least for 1861, early 1862, there wasn't a huge impact in Britain. So that kind of hopefulness that this kind of strategy would lead to even, like I said, possibly even Britain entering the war on the side of the Confederacy, never happened. Now, of course, the North itself, the remaining states in the Union, all of their cotton for their mills in Massachusetts and in New England also came from the South. So it was kind of a two-pronged kind of attempt by the Confederacy to hurt the North through economic things, but also bring in European powers. Unfortunately, that did not, as I said, did not succeed. And by 1862, the South was very much in need to get some capital itself so it could purchase the supplies required to fit out its troops to combat the Northern Union forces. So that meant starting shipping this cotton back over to Europe.
Okay. Could you just explain blockade running in general for somebody that doesn't actually understand what the blockade actually is?
Sure. The blockade was one of the very first things that Abraham Lincoln set up when he was president. A week after the Battle of Fort Sumter, Lincoln signed the proclamation to enact a blockade. And what a blockade is basically stopping, for this purpose, vessels, steamers, sailing vessels, merchantmen, from entering the ports of the South, the ports of the Confederacy. Now, there weren't many large ports in the South. Once again, one of the kind of negative physical kind of downsides to their struggle in the conflict. New Orleans was the biggest port, and also the biggest port for cotton export. And then you're looking at places like Mobile, Charleston, Wilmington. So the blockade was intended to stop ships entering or leaving those ports without being at least boarded and searched by Union Navy. And if there was anything found on board that could be construed as instruments of war, contraband, military items, then that vessel can be taken as prize. And blockades had been used since the Middle Ages, and there was actually a pretty strong maritime law around blockade. One of the interesting things about the blockade during the Civil War is, can you blockade your own ports? So if you're in the North and you think that the South is acting completely illegally, they're not a new country, they're just in revolt, then you would possibly legally find yourself blockading cities and ports that were still your own port. So would that be a legal blockade? But I think that's something that's a bit more of a discussion for another time. Mm-hmm. But as you can see, this drawing, contemporary drawing, kind of shows the idea that the Union would not only on the water, but through the control of the Mississippi, squeeze the Confederacy, squeeze the South, so that they couldn't get cotton out. They couldn't get military weapons in. They couldn't get supplies in, food in, and the other things needed to maintain their military viability with the Union. And a main point here is that not only were the many ports not very large, but most of the armories, the mints, the industrial capability of the United States was in Union states. So a lot of these things just couldn't be built at the time in southern states, in the cities of the South. So that is why the blockade was key from the Union side to stop things getting in, and from the Confederacy side to allow them to maintain some kind of semblance of readiness, of fighting prowess.
Yeah, and that's so stuff coming into the north. Did it only go? Obviously, it would only go to the northern ports, but God, they must have been taking in a lot of stuff. If they, do you know what I mean? Because obviously, I mean, what with New York and places like that,
Boston, New York, Philadelphia.
Yeah.
The two main prize ports, for example. So if a ship was captured, and we'll get onto that in a little bit, I think. If a ship was captured trying to violate the blockade, it could be taken to New York or Boston, where the prize courts were set up to evaluate the circumstances of its capture, to see what was on board, to depose important individuals, captains, engineers, and so on. And then the court would rule if it was a legal prize. If it was a legal prize, then all the cargo and the vessel would be auctioned to the highest bidder. And that money would then be distributed to the capturer, or the sailors, or the multiple sailors on multiple ships who caught that vessel. So catching a blockade runner intact could be financially life-changing, from everyone from the captain, even the admiral controlling the fleet, all the way down to sailors and boilermakers. So it's one of the things that's interesting, that there was a lot of money to be had by captains running things into the blockade, but also a lot of money to be had by the people trying to capture the ship.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've never heard that point before. So yeah, I mean, obviously I knew it went on, but I've not really looked into it much. So what sort of ships are we talking about, and why are they so suited to blockade running in particular?
Well, at the start of the blockade, it was almost a blockade on paper. So the Union Navy, it didn't have many ships. A lot of them were, straddled around the globe, waiting to be called back. So at the start, quite slow vessels, merchantmen, even sailing vessels, could run the blockade without much threat of being caught. Getting into 1862, by the middle of 1862, that wasn't the case anymore. The Union Navy had either purchased or started building vessels. They have maybe captured some. They focused their efforts on these ports of Wilmington and Charleston. New Orleans is captured quite early in the war, so that was knocked out early. So by 1862, vessels like this, like paddle steamer vessels from Liverpool, Glasgow, Bristol, and London, were ideal to run the blockade. Now, these are not blue water, open seas vessels. These are primarily coastal going, or Irish Sea ferries, or across to Europe ferries. They're not meant to go thousands of miles across the ocean. What they're really good at is making their way up rivers, making very fast journeys, and taking lots of cargo. Many of these would either be completely cargo vessels or a hybrid passenger cargo. So you'd have space for livestock, you'd have space for first-class passengers. But primarily, the best benefits of these vessels is they were fast, and they could get into harder to reach areas. So if you can imagine kind of the west coast of Scotland, all the little kind of ports, not even ports, jetties, little docks that needed to be supplied. Glasgow itself was, building ships that were ideal for that purpose. They were shallow draft, they could maneuver very easily, high speeds, as well as good amounts of cargo. So if you could get these vessels across the Atlantic, if you could get them from Liverpool or Glasgow to Bermuda, to Nassau, to Havana, even in Cuba, that was used, in neutral ports, where they could then be loaded up with the supplies and run into the Confederate ports, then these were ideal for you to have. If you could get them across the ocean, because several of them did not make that great trek. They sunk before they made it. But these are the things that when the agents came over from North Carolina, from Virginia, from private companies in the 1860s, these were the ships they were looking to buy.
Okay. And obviously, some of these ships were sent unarmed by Britain, wasn't they? Because otherwise, that's basically an act of war against the United States. If we're sending over warships to the Confederacy, we're basically, we're going to be in a situation. So, how were they converted and then used as warships and rammers, and where did that take place?
It's a very good point you just made there, Darren. For blockade running, these vessels weren't armed at all. As long as you didn't fire back, as long as you didn't put up an armed struggle, you would be seen as a non-combatant. We'll get to that. But in terms of the armed vessels, there were some ships intended to be armed frigates, armed warships that were built in Glasgow or Liverpool. Some of the most famous ones being the Alabama, which I think for your viewers, I don't really have to go into the history of that. The Florida and the Shenandoah, but they weren't built. They weren't like you said. They weren't kitted out in the docks in Liverpool. They would be kitted out ostentatiously as a merchant ship, and a lot of the ships sold for the blockade were not, at least on paper or in the news, sold to the Confederacy. A lot of them were sold to what was known at the time the Celestial Emperor, or the Emperor of China, or the Emperor of Japan. But that was really code for the Confederacy. But back to the warships, they would sail from British waters, make to a neutral port or international waters, many times off the Azores, which is a coaling station between Europe and North and South America. And there, vessels that had either been sent from the Confederacy or had taken on cargo at Nassau or Bermuda would meet them. They transfer over the crew. They transfer over the weapons, the ammunition. If they did need any other kind of extra armament, that could be done. When it came to things like Confederate rams and like monitor type vessels, those a lot of times were done in the Confederacy themselves, those kind of vessels not being open water kind of rated. But even then, a lot of that stuff was taken through the blockade on these runners, the armor plating, the cannons, gunpowder, for example. So you're right in saying that they didn't sail out of the Mersey flying a Confederate flag with cannons ready to go. They'd be kitted out in a place that was hopefully away from Union Navy eyes, and in an area where it would be safe enough to transfer these kind of important goods, make these vessels ready to go raiding.
Okay. And what about the people on board? So you've got the privateers and obviously the blockade runners themselves. Tell us a little bit about them, because they really interest me.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the crews of the blockade runners were indeed Europeans, British, English, Scottish, Irish. I've found French, Portuguese, Swedish. And the reason being is there were quite a few of these ships. There was a need for trained and experienced officers and engineers in this latest kind of technology. These vessels, some of them had been purchased that had been built in the 1850s, but by the middle to the end of the war, the blockade runners were being built to spec, as blockade runners. And to have an engineer who had experience on these ships would have been vital for its kind of success. So there was a lot of as I said, British sailors involved. There was Royal Navy officers on furlough, basically taking some time away to possibly earn great fortunes. There were seamen, boilermakers, cooks. And there's a great book called Clyde Built, which looks at Glasgow's and Scotland's contribution specifically by Dr. Eric Graham. And he reckons over 3,000 Scottish sailors alone were involved in the blockade. So it was thousands and thousands. And most of them were going to try to make a bit of money, and actually quite a bit of money. Privateers could possibly make up to $5,000 as a captain for a successful run. So that's a run in and then a run out, the two legs, if you will. That was a huge amount of money at the time. It's hard to kind of say what it is in today's money, but the captain I've studied, Jonas Wiley, when he was a first officer, he was making $45 a month on his ship before he started the blockade. So to make $5,000 as a captain would have been astronomical. State-run vessels, like his vessel, the Advance, it's kind of like working for the council a little bit. You're not making much money, but maybe you have more job security. They'd pay their captains $1,000 for the completed trip. Now, that was still a huge amount at the time.
Yeah. And so, what if they get caught or captured by the United States? Do they get put in prison, or what happens
Well,
to them?
as we mentioned, it was behoven on the Union Navy not to try to sink these vessels. If they spotted a runner going in or coming out, they would try to run it down and then to board it and then to take it as prize. And as I mentioned, if you fought back, if you fired a cannon, if you fired a rifle, then it could be seen as an act of war. So the Confederates on these ships, now they could face prison, they can face imprisonment, they could try to kind of claim, oh, I didn't know a blockade was on. There's a famous story from on the Advance from when it was captured that the first engineer recounted that some of the Carolinian sailors tried to put on their best English accent, Mike, to try to fool the Union sailors into letting them go. But British sailors or European sailors, if they were captured, as long as they didn't fight back, there was basically an understanding that you might face a bit of time in custody. You might be taken back to a Union port, to New York or Boston for questioning. But as long as you didn't have any kind of physical aggression against the Union Navy, you'd be released. So a British sailor could find himself, hopefully doing a couple months, maybe a couple runs on one of these ships, and come back to Britain a very wealthy person. The Confederate officers or Confederate sailors would be captured and probably then taken to a prisoner of war camp. So, sometimes the biggest, and actually probably the biggest kind of threat to some of these runners is probably just the ocean waves itself. You know, these ships laden down with hundreds and hundreds of cotton bales or full of, you know, iron plating to be used for armor on rams or monitors, could easily find themselves in quite a bit of trouble if it came to larger waves, especially in the South. In the autumn, it's hurricane season, but you're still wanting to run these kind of supplies in. So as long as they didn't fight back, it was a golden opportunity for these sailors.
Okay. And one of the tactics that the Confederates used was Comoss raiding, and I know the British used this a lot. I mean, even in Elizabeth the first time, we was taking Spanish warships and nicking their gold and all sorts. So explain Comoss raiding, please, and what the
Well,
Confederates was
well,
raiding.
at least when it came, I know when it came to the kind of the blockade running, because there's the maritime law um, in place. It said for getting a prize and then auctioning off. And I should say a lot of these vessels that were captured and auctioned off were then bought by the Union Navy and became themselves blockaders, so stopping blockade runners through. But you know, primarily, if you're looking for kind of commercial rating, you're looking at being able to hound your enemy or your opponent's kind of mercantile abilities. You're wanting to put stress on any kind of trade routes, and possibly if you get into a bit of a fight with another warship, to possibly capture that ship that could then once again be turned into another warship or another merchantman for your navy. And it was something that you said that's been going on for hundreds and hundreds of years, and into the age of steam. And some people think, you know, when the Industrial Revolution came along, you know, all those kind of old tactics died out. But no, I mean, the Civil War, you know, everyone kind of thinks about the land war and how tactics changed and how that changed the kind of face of war. But you're still starting from a very, you know, kind of early 19th century start of how you fight and how you regiment your soldiers.
Okay. And so we're going to talk a tiny little bit about your book. So just going to go backwards. So obviously, without giving too much away, please tell us a little bit about Jonas Wiley and the Advance.
When we were doing that display in 2015, Glasgow Museum has this absolutely fantastic oil painting of the Advance. And it was completed by Samuel Walters, who is a noted maritime artist, Liverpool-based maritime artist. That's it right there. And we have that in the collection. It came to us in 1917. And it turns out that this painting was owned by a guy called Jonas Wiley. There was a little plaque on it, like paintings tend to have. It came to us via his nephew about a decade after Wiley's death in 1902. Now, the Advance is a well-researched vessel. We know it was called the Lord Clyde when it was launched in the summer of 1862. We know it was captured. We know all this kind of information from the prize corps document. But this name, Jonas Wiley, it was not much known about him. So I entered that name into the British newspaper archive, which is a fantastic service if any of your viewers are interested. And luckily, it's quite a unique name. It's not James Smith or something like that. And a couple hits came up. And at that time, the name appeared in some of the books about blockade running, about the Civil War, but it was very much kind of a footnote. And even when it was a footnote, there was contradictory kind of information about, was he English, Scottish? There wasn't any definitive information. But these first initial kind of hits on the British newspaper archive located him to be a farmer, strangely enough, a farmer in Fife, which is north of Edinburgh for your possibly non-Scottish or non-British viewers, a farmer in Fife who gave regular lectures about his time on the blockade. And that really piqued my interest because, first of all, it gave us much more of a knowledge about him. And I should say the photograph that appears on the book is the only known photograph of Wiley, and it came in with the painting itself. It gave us a bit more knowledge about him. We could tell a bit more about the human story. So it's not just kind of a nebulous blockade runners, but here was a man that we could point to. And then it led me to think, what else can we find out about this person? So that was 2014, 2015. And I'm very happy to say that this May, Widows Publishing is coming out, or is bringing out my book about the life of Jonas Wiley and his time on the Advance, which I think will be the best ever history of the vessel ever to be put to page. I cover all of its voyages, and where I've been able to find it, I've been able to include the stories of officers, of other sailors, of Wiley himself, of passengers, of other people that knew him. So bringing very much a kind of a human side to this story. I would like to add this painting, although it looks like it might be the vessel making a run into Wilmington. Sadly, it's just a generic background that Walters did for several of his paintings. That's Tusker Lighthouse off the southeast coast of Ireland. So it looks great. It is great, but it's not a run at the time.
No.
So yes, it's been a fantastic kind of journey for me as a curator to be able to bring to life some of our objects in the museum, but also to look at one of these British sailors who only a few ever came back and told their stories. And there's kind of a handful, even like I probably count on one hand, the stories that were put down either by themselves in the 19th century or by biographers afterwards. So it offers another unique kind of perspective, Scottish perspective from a sailor from here, but also a perspective about the war in North Carolina, which this ship was owned by the state. It wasn't a privateer. It was a vessel that was bringing in much needed things for the people and the armies of North Carolina.
That is absolutely, I'm really excited about this book, I must admit.
Oh, thank you, Darren.
Yeah, I am actually, because again, this is not covered enough, is it really? And naval history in the American Civil War in general, I don't think is covered enough. I think it got forgotten about a little bit. So I find it quite exciting.
A little anecdote is when I kind of pitched this book to a couple of publishers, several of them said, the Civil War is very much, it's very active in terms of its research, in terms of its academic kind of publication, but the naval war and the war at sea is neglected in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
Very much past the things like the Alabama, Florida, and so on, which are obviously very important and famous vessels and have a lot of books dedicated to them.
Yeah. Anyway, so also, again, you have got an interview coming up with the Civil War Roundtable UK. So people that would like to see that video and stuff, tell us a little bit about how they'll be able to go about that.
Yeah, I've been invited to give a talk at the American Civil War Roundtable UK's spring conference. It's themed War on the Waters, so perfect for these two purposes. You can book to see that. It's on the 15th of May at 1:30 in the afternoon. It's at acwrt.co.uk, and it's entitled under the events page, "A Better Commander Cannot Be Had," which is a quote about Wiley himself. The book will be coming out in May as well, so perfect timing. If you are interested in the book, you can find out a little bit more at whittlespublishing.com. It is available for pre-order at the moment. 256 pages. I've packed it with lots of images, so it's not kind of text dense. There's some great colorful images like this painting here, and it's on sale for $18.99. I think it's a great story. I'm sure my coworkers will attest that I talk to them a lot about it. So if you're interested, please do go to their website. And if you're interested in the talk, which will be more about Wiley's life and his career, please do go to the Civil War Roundtable page.
Okay. Well, I will make sure all the links are below, ladies and gentlemen, for John's for the UK Civil War Roundtable seminar and everything to do with the museum. So if you live in the area, go and visit it once a great pandemic of 2020-21's over, or the plague, as I like to call it, which has ruined everyone's lives. No, I'm only joking. Right. So anyway, John, I really appreciate you coming to talk to me, mate. It was absolutely brilliant. I'm really excited about this book. You were absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much, Darren. I appreciate it. And best of luck to your site here. I know it's growing all the time, so it's great to have more people talking about Civil War history.
Thank you very much. Cheers.